Not having kids is selfish. This claim collapses the moment you ask a simple question. Selfish toward whom? Selfishness requires a victim, someone whose interests are being ignored or harmed. So who exactly is being wronged when someone chooses not to have children? There is no child, no mind, person, or unmet need, no denied experience. You cannot harm someone who does not exist. So the accusation fails immediately. It tries to assign moral wrongdoing where there is no subject to receive harm. It's not just wrong, it's incoherent. Now compare that to the opposite action, having a child. In that case, a very real person does exist, and that person is guaranteed to experience harm. Not hypothetically, not in rare cases, but universally. Pain, illness, anxiety, loss, and death are not possibilities, they are built-in features of existence. So one option creates zero victims, the other creates a guaranteed sufferer. And somehow the first one is called selfish. That's not ethics, that's inversion. Let's go further. People often argue that not having children is selfish because you're withholding life, as if life is some benefit you're obligated to distribute. But this collapses under basic logic. You can't deprive someone of something unless there is someone there to be deprived. There is no queue of unborn people waiting for existence, no consciousness floating in limbo saying, "Please create me." The idea of denying life assumes a subject that does not exist. So again, no victim, no deprivation, no selfishness. Some try to reframe it differently, as a failure to share resources, that choosing not to have children means you're selfishly hoarding your time, money, and energy instead of giving them to a future person. But this argument falls apart the moment it touches reality. Parents are not redistributing resources to those in need, they are concentrating them on their own biological extensions, not on existing suffering children, not on the millions already alive who lack food, stability, or care. Their concern is not a child, it's their child, their genes, their continuation. That's not generosity, that's selective investment. If this were really about sharing, the focus wouldn't be on creating new dependents, it would be on helping the ones already here. But that's rarely the priority. Adoption is treated as optional at best, while reproduction is defended as instinct, destiny, or right. So the accusation flips again. The person who refuses to create a new mouth to feed is called selfish, while the person who adds another dependent to an already strained world and directs their resources inward toward their own lineage is praised as giving. But if the table is already breaking, adding another seat isn't generosity, it's denial. Now flip the lens. Why do people have children? Not one reason originates from the child. It can't. The child doesn't exist to have interests or desires. Every reason comes from the parent. I want meaning. I want connection. I want a legacy. I want to experience raising a child. These are all self-referential. They're about fulfilling personal desires, solving personal fears, or meeting social expectations. That doesn't automatically make someone evil, but it does destroy the claim that the act is selfless. Because a truly selfless act cannot be centered on fulfilling your own needs. And here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Parents love to frame their sacrifices as the height of altruism, but you cannot claim moral credit for solving a problem you created. A child did not have needs until someone forced them into existence. A child did not know hunger, fear, or pain until someone decided to satisfy their own biological or emotional drive. Creating a sentient being with a 100% guarantee of eventual suffering and death, just so you can feel selfless while raising them, is not virtue. It's a closed loop dressed up as morality. Now let's examine the hidden assumption behind the accusation. When people say not having kids is selfish, what they often mean is you're not contributing, You're not continuing the family. You're not maintaining the system. You're not doing what's expected. In other words, the selfishness isn't about harming a person, it's about refusing a role. You're not serving a collective expectation. That's not a moral argument, that's social pressure disguised as ethics. And it exposes something deeper. The accusation is not defending a victim, it's defending a norm. Because if choosing not to reproduce is accepted as valid, then reproduction stops being treated as morally exempt from scrutiny. It becomes a decision that requires justification, like any other action that imposes risk and harm on another person. And that's uncomfortable. Because once you start asking for justification, you run into a wall. What gives anyone the right to impose existence with all its unavoidable suffering on someone who cannot consent? Nothing gives you that right. It is simply taken, without permission, without necessity, and without accountability. So instead of addressing the question, the culture redirects attention. It labels the refusal as selfish, hoping the insult will shut down the discussion before it starts. It's not an argument, it's a deflection. There's also a logical asymmetry people ignore. Not creating someone prevents all possible suffering, with no downside because there is no one to miss out. Creating someone guarantees some level of suffering for the sake of a benefit they never asked for. So one path avoids harm entirely. The other introduces harm for the possibility of benefit. Calling the harm avoidance path selfish is not just incorrect, it's backwards at a structural level. Finally, consider this. If someone creates a life primarily to satisfy their own desires, emotional, social, or existential, and that life will inevitably suffer, age, and die, how is that less selfish than refusing to do so? It isn't. The truth is much simpler and much less comfortable. Not having children harms no one. Having children always risks harming someone and guarantees some degree of it. So the claim doesn't just fail, it reverses reality. It takes the only option that avoids imposing harm and labels it immoral, while framing the imposition itself as virtue. So yes, not having kids is selfish is a dismissal, a lazy, guilt-soaked, culturally programmed way to avoid accountability. It takes one of the most personal and ethical decisions a person can make to opt out of creating new life and smears it with shame. The truly selfish act isn't the refusal to create life, it's the arrogance of believing your desire to see your own eyes reflected in a child's face is worth the cost of that child's inevitable suffering, labor, and death. It is the ego-driven carnage of procreating without consent in a world on fire. So let's flip the script permanently. The person who abstains is the one showing restraint. The person who abstains is the one showing mercy. Parenting is an appetite. Childlessness is a conviction. If refusing to gamble with a human life for the sake of your own ego is selfish, then the word has lost all meaning.